Okay, welcome everybody to the Roadmap Spectrum session. I'm Salous from Durham University and I'm moderating this session. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists. We've got Prakash Moorut from Nokia Bell Labs and Eric Fournier from the National Frequency Agency in France. We also have Monisha Ghosh from FCC and two speakers from OFCOM UK. We've got Saunders and Cristina. The session will address several topics, very important topics, and one of the first important topics is the role of the Next World Radio Communications Conference, WRC 23, and also followed by WRC 27. And we're looking at different frequencies, possibly the sub-terahertz bands. For example, the WRC 19 looked at frequencies between 24 to 80 to 71 gigahertz. And now we're moving up in the spectrum to the W and D bands. Of course, for coverage, we're always looking at lower frequencies, and the considerations for frequencies between 6 to 7 gigahertz and the mid-band at 3.5 gigahertz will also be addressed in the session. Spectrum sharing modalities is also an important topic for 6G, and the convergence of terrestrial and non-terrestrial services. And another topic, which is of vital importance, is the dedicated spectrum allocation for verticals, for example, private networks, industrial environments, UAVs, and so on. So I'd like to welcome the first speaker, and we'll start with Prakash. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana. Great to be here and great to be on this panel with the other esteemed colleagues. Looking forward to a great discussion. So I'm Prakash Moorut and I head the Spectrum team for Nokia globally. As you know, we are deploying 5G at full speed and 6G still has a long way to go. Still is in the early days. And what I wanted to do today is just share some thoughts of what we should be considering as we explore spectrum for 6G. So if you can go to the next slide. So for 5G, as you know, we've deployed 5G in licensed, shared, and unlicensed spectrum, or at least we've been unlocking these three types of spectrum in order to enable 5G. We prefer obviously licensed spectrum because it provides exclusive use and then ensures quality of service. On the other extreme, you have unlicensed spectrum, which has some unpredictable quality of service. And one new model that we've seen getting traction in 5G is the managed shared access. And the word manage is key here, at least for us. This means that you have some sort of a spectrum access system, for example, that manage access to the spectrum to enable sharing with incumbents, but also sharing among the new entrants. And what we've seen is that shared spectrum will get more and more traction, especially in the context of 6G. I think shared spectrum will become, more prevalent compared to maybe other types of approaches. We have, currently we use a server to manage access, but I think going forward for 6G, we may see the use of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and basically going to more cognitive sharing of spectrum, where the devices themselves perhaps can share the spectrum and then decide which spectrum blocks to use. So this is an area where there's a lot of research happening in US and in other places, and maybe something we can discuss a bit later today. Next. So this is just a snapshot of some of the key bands for 5G for some maybe key markets, just to show what I was talking about in the previous slide. So taking the example of the US, as you may know, FCC just auctioned the C-band spectrum from 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz, which is a licensed band, and it brought in $81 billion of proceeds for the US. FCC also made available a shared spectrum in the Citizens Broadband Radio Service band, or CBRS band, from 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz, while also opening 1.2 gigahertz of unlicensed spectrum from 5.925 to 7.125 gigahertz. And I think going forward, you're going to see, some of this also being made available in other places. So more unlicensed, more shared spectrum, and we need really to be able to use that as we move forward for 6G. Next. Okay, I guess one mistake we should not make is to focus only on what I call the ultra high bands. I know there's a lot of focus on these ultra high bands and spectrum above 92 gigahertz. Obviously the boundary for ultra high band has not been formally consolidated or defined, but we think that probably above 92 gigahertz would be the next frontier, but we'll use. I think we'll also need low bands, mid bands, and high bands. So low bands, for coverage, obviously, mid bands for wide area coverage and capacity, the high bands, like millimeter wave bands, for example, for extreme capacity, and then ultra high band for peak capacity and also sensing and other applications. So I think as we explore spectrum for 6G, let's make sure that we explore all of these four categories of spectrum, not just the ultra high band. Next. So another way to look at this is as this is shown here in this figure. So for 5G, we look at spectrum below 6 gigahertz, expanding it to 400 megahertz approximately. We also look at spectrum above 24.25 gigahertz and up to 52.6 gigahertz, for example, in 3GPP, which is called FR2. In ITU, we even explored up to 71 gigahertz, as Sana was saying. And I think we can see evolution of 5G or 5G evolution exploring bands up to 92 gigahertz. So as we move to 6G, as I said, we'll still need those low frequencies, these high frequencies, but there's this gap between 7 and 24 gigahertz where I think we should be looking for spectrum. That could be some prime spectrum for 6G. And then in addition, we have these ultra high bands above 92 gigahertz. So I think with 6G, we're going to have all the range from 410 or 400 megahertz up to 300 gigahertz that will be explored for different use cases. So next. So one may think that getting access to spectrum in the sub-terahertz range above 92 gigahertz will be easy. So I just wanted to put up this chart here just to show the incumbents we have to deal with in these high, ultra high bands. So we have passive services, we have other services, and there's also a ITU radio regulation that prevents transmission in several blocks above 92 gigahertz. So, if we say that we need 10 gigahertz of spectrum above 92 gigahertz, it may not be that obvious to find it in all of these different ranges above 92 gigahertz, like the W band, for example, that's shown in the light blue at the top here. If you need to avoid some of the bands that are used by passive services, you may not be able, for example, to get a contiguous block of 10 gigahertz, but you may need to do carrier aggregation in order to get there. D-band has some blocks up to maybe 12.5 gigahertz that available if you exclude some of these bands that are prohibited. So as we explore this terahertz band, coexistence with these passive services in adjacent bands will be important. And then the other question, I guess, some may ask themselves is whether or not we need access to some of these bands that are prohibited today. So again, this is just a question I'm putting on the table. I think that's something we'll need to discuss as an industry and also with the incumbents in the band to see how we can get access to that spectrum in this range. Next. Okay, so I thought I'll just conclude with Nokia's view on the ITU and then 3GPP 6G schedule. As I said, right now we're still in the research phase for 6G. In ITU, we start a report on future technology trends, so exploring what technologies are coming down the pipeline. We also started a Vision 2030 recommendation, looking at use cases, scenarios, etc., that could leverage these technologies. And all of this work will culminate at WRC 23, so World Radio Conference of 2023, where perhaps a new agenda item is approved for new bands that can then be studied between WRC 23 and then WRC 27. And then new bands are then identified at WRC 27. From a 3GPP point of view, we think we need the specs sometime around the 2028, 2029 timeframe, so that then we can have the spectrum and the 3GPP specs ready, so that we can deploy around 2030. So from a Nokia's point of view, we see deployments in 2030 with all of this coming together around 2028 or 2029. So let me just stop here, and then looking forward for further discussions and questions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Eric. Eric, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, and good day to everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to present our views on the 6G spectrum roadmap. As a spectrum manager working for the government, I'm still working hard on 5G implementation, so 6G is still quite far. But it's nice to see research and industry already pushing hard for the next generation of mobile technology. And I have to admit that spectrum issues always deserve some early consideration. So clearly, and it was already stated, one of the main considerations for 6G spectrum is this focus which is made on the future use of sub-terahertz spectrum. And as a matter of fact, this spectrum is yet much less used than lower spectrum. Please, next slide. Even if you compare to what happened for 5G in the millimeter wave, at the time where we started to think about millimeter wave for 5G in terms of spectrum management, there were already some use for decades of this frequency band by fixed service and also by other services. In this respect, the use of spectrum above 90 gigahertz, sub-terahertz spectrum, for example, the W band and D band, which have been mentioned by Prakash, is still in the very early start of implementation. In France, for example, we have absolutely no use of this frequency band for fixed service for the time being. However, there are other services. For example, passive services, and I will expand on that in my next slide, and also some other usage. No, not next slide, please back yet. Some of these other usage are of course, for satellite application, and there may be some interest in the future, but it's not yet used very clearly. Satellite, it's only for the time being. The upper band is QV band, so something in the 40, 50 gigahertz band. But there are some of the services which are already started to use this frequency band. I would just like to mention one example, which is the enhanced flights visibility system, which is discussed in ICAO. This system is here to enable aircraft to land on small airport where you don't have ILS kind of navigation system. So it's enabling small aircraft to land all over the world, including in small aircraft, including in very low visibility or no visibility conditions. And this system is really looking at 95, 100 gigahertz, so precisely in the WB band. I think the process for identifying this sub-terahertz 6G band will be needed. That's clear. I would agree with the previous presentation that we will have to consider some identification by WRC. If you look back to 5G, there was a kind of mismatch between the identification at WRC 19, which was quite late compared to the 5G deployment, which in some countries started earlier. In this respect, the WRC timeline is much better for 6G. I would agree with the timeline which was put forward by Prakash in the previous presentation. So a kind of rendezvous in WRC 927, which assume that there's a possibility as early as WRC 23 to put that 6G item on the WRC 27 agenda, since the agenda of a WRC is always decided by the previous WRC. And of course, with that nicer timeline for 6G compared to 5G, there would be the possibility at the European regional level to agree on proposal on what could be appropriate, including some technical conditions for protecting the other services. And certainly there's also a need of having a work at the national level. It's anecdotic, but in France, the regulator, which is ARCEP, has absolutely no access to spectrum above 90 gigahertz except for the amateur service. So it's just highlighting that there's a long path towards making clear that the sub-terahertz spectrum can be used for 5G. Next slide, please. So I read a few days ago again that 6G could benefit from large bunch of spectrum, and there was a reference to even more than 100 gigahertz of spectrum for an emission. So I prepared this slide before just to highlight that things are not so simple, and I could see that Prakash in the previous presentations already made it clear that it will be very difficult to have this kind of large bunch of spectrum. Here I'm focusing on WB band and on D band, but the same would be true for all bands up to 1 terahertz. When you are looking to the figure which is on the right, which describes the spectrum lines and the corresponding zenith loss, you can see that you have spectrum lines all over the spectrum. For 6G industry, this kind of data is to be considered for calculating propagation loss and windows where loss is minimized. But for scientists, this is really something which enables to decide where they have to make Earth observations and which are necessary in particular for climate change. It's a nice playing field for them. They can observe concentration in oxygen, water, carbon monoxide, ozone, ammoniac, and spectrum lines for these molecules are just law of physics. You cannot say rationalize spectrum lines of molecules. That's very clear. So the figure below, which are echoing what also Prakash had said, are limited to W and D band, and you can see this split of spectrum between passive bands and mobile or fixed band. So of course, when I say mobile and fixed band, in some cases there's also some sharing with some other active services, but it's recognized that the use for the time being is quite limited, but there will be also a need to ensure some coexistence. I would be much more pessimistic than Prakash on the possibility to have sharing at least for the passive service band because of the very high sensitivity of these passive measurements, which are integrating in time and in spectrum in order to reduce the sensitivity much below the noise level that you can have in normal communication system. In Europe, we have already worked on protection of those bands from fixed service. That's part of the 2 recommendations that have been adopted within CPT, CC recommendation 1801 and 1802 for respectively WB band and D band. And the unwanted emission limits, which was derived here for fixed service, is minus 55 dB watt per 100 megahertz. So it's very low, and that's for unwanted emission, and that's based on assumption for fixed service. So I don't know at all how it could translate to 6G, but it at least mean that it's something where you can only envisage some unwanted emission and not something which would be wanted signal. Next slide, please. So back again to 5G, because we have to learn from what happened for 5G. So even if sub-terahertz attract attention of researcher, I would certainly agree with the statement that the real focus when we will approach 2030 will be mid-bands, because that's where mid-bands combine coverage and capacity. I'm sure it will be the same for 6G. So when we were at the time of 5G, in say 2016, 2017, in Europe, we had a nice position with 3.438 gigahertz, which was earmarked for mobile for 4 years, in fact, and lightly used at that time. There was very limited 4G networks in this frequency range. So it became very easily the primary 5G band. So the question is really what will happen for 6G. I'm not totally sure we can only, or we could only have some refarming of 5G band into a 6G. What I can learn from all the past, and that also include 4G and not only 5G, that operators love to have some new fresh band for implementing new technology and demonstrate benefits, rather than having a complex refarming process with previous technology which are using all bands. The question is really, could we have this opportunity for 6G? There's obviously the possibility of having more sharing features in 6G. That was already mentioned when we were discussing 5G a few years ago, and I would really be keen in having 6G, say, behaving better than 5G, so having some really features implementing and easing sharing with other services. But that really is something which would be one of the focus for 6G, I think, and 6G standardization in particular. Also, in terms of practical solution, there's this upper 6 gigahertz band, which is discussed in region 1, so in Europe in particular, which could make some interesting solution at the horizon of 2030, considering that there's also a lot of incumbent services in this frequency band. So that's something we could keep in mind from the European perspective. Anyway, there's something here on which I have no response yet. What will be the solution in mid-bands for 5G? But once again, this has to be considered as early as possible. No solution will be easy to find and to implement. So that's completing my short presentation. I would be, of course, very happy to respond to any question. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Monisha from the FCC. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk. And the previous speakers had excellent slides. And if I had slides, I would have saying what they were saying anyway. I do wear two hats. Today, I'm here representing the FCC. I'm also a research professor at the University of Chicago. But whatever I express as my views, they don't necessarily represent the FCC. So having said that, let me just start off with some of the recent actions that the FCC has taken in the area of spectrum. Some of this was already touched on by the previous speakers. But in short, over the last, maybe 5 or 6 years, the FCC has had a very targeted plan for making spectrum available, not only for 5G, but we envisage that this spectrum will continue into the next generation. So in the millimeter wave or the high band, we've had auctions in 24, 28, 37, 39, 47. And at the end of it, there's almost 5 gigahertz of millimeter wave spectrum available in the US. I believe this is probably the largest available in the world. And we are seeing rapid rollouts of millimeter wave based 5G across the urban areas in the US. We're also working to free up additional spectrum, about almost 3 gigahertz of spectrum in the 26 and 42 gigahertz bands. And we're also looking at making more efficient use of additional millimeter wave spectrum in the 70, 80, and 90 gigahertz band. As has been mentioned by the previous two speakers, mid-band is where everybody wants to be, balancing coverage and throughput. In this area, the most recent action that the FCC did was to come up with proposed rules for the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band. This is the band 100 megahertz of spectrum sitting right below CBRS, which was 3.55 to 3.7, and which was auctioned off last year. This is also going to be a shared band, and you will see that the theme of sharing, coexistence, adjacent channel is going to grow in importance. It was very important in 5G, and it's only going to become more important as we look into 6G. However, in the FCC, we're also trying to look at different modalities of sharing. So for example, in CBRS, we went with the spectrum access system, which is a combination of spectrum sensors and databases to provide access to operators who want to use that spectrum. And there were tiered services. You had the priority access licenses, which were auctioned, and you also had the general authorized access, where you didn't need to pay for a license, but you were in tier 3. In 3.45, even though we are similar incumbents there in terms of federal systems, we are trying a different sharing modality. We are hoping to be able to make this work without databases, without exclusive regions where the spectrum cannot be used, but trying to see if we can do a cooperative sharing in those areas of the country where this spectrum is going to be needed for federal use occasionally. We are also continuing to looking at the entire band. So if you've looked at the rules in the US recently, it is a little bit different in each of these bands. So 3.45 to 3.55 has higher power, CBRS has lower power. And then again, when you go into C band 3.7, the power goes up again. So harmonizing this band is very difficult because of all of the different incumbents. But that is something we're looking at in the longer term future. Low band, we continue to make changes. We know that low band is great for wider coverage and for just staying connected, but that's not where we're going to see the gigabits per second throughputs. However, low band, and when I say low band, it's really around less than a gigahertz of frequency. We continue to look at it, and making it more efficient. We have also spent a lot of energy and time on unlicensed. Eric mentioned the upper 6 gigahertz band. In the US, we decided to make the entire 6 gigahertz band unlicensed because of the number of incumbents there, which would make licensing even part of the band extremely difficult. Because as everybody knows, licensing spectrum that already has incumbents in there goes into the process of moving incumbents out or figuring out a way to allocate them to new spectrum and then auctioning off that spectrum. Instead, making the spectrum unlicensed with rules that allow sharing, we believe is a faster way to get spectrum out the door, so to speak, so people can start using it. And we made this decision knowing full well that this unlicensed spectrum, even though, as Prakash mentioned, it has quality of service issues, it's not as reliable, is being used heavily already in the US, at least, in 4G, not even 5G. We've seen 4G plus license-assisted access being deployed in the urban areas widely. And we expect that to continue with the 6 gigahertz and 5G and 6 gigahertz and 6G. A lot of numbers there. And when we're talking about 6G, I think as a community, we should stop thinking about it being just a cellular network. I envision 6G as really being, from the user perspective, a pervasive network that connects you when you need to be, whether it's going over unlicensed or licensed, it should matter less. We also have the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding above 95 gigahertz, which has been available for a few years now. It's more on the experimental licensing basis. That spectrum is available for folks who are already experimenting with terahertz and other high frequency experiments. Somebody mentioned, either Eric or Prakash, about the gap between, say, 7 and 24. And we do have a proceeding out there, the 12 gigahertz proceeding, that's 500 megahertz of spectrum that could be shared with incumbent satellite services. The comments on that proceeding were due a month ago, but they got moved back and they should be coming in a couple of days. We look forward to seeing what the industry and other stakeholders' views are about looking at that spectrum. So as you've probably realized at this point is that the challenges for 6G spectrum continues the challenges for 5G spectrum, is that you have to share. It's going to be very, very difficult to find clean spectrum in the mid bands that everybody wants that can be licensed easily. So if you're going to license, you've got to figure out what to do in incumbents there. If you're going to share, you've got to figure out sharing mechanisms. And this is where I think as a community, both as a spectrum community and as a research community, we should start looking at different ways of sharing. So for example, one of the modalities we explored in the 6 gigahertz unlicensed band was indoor-outdoor sharing. Could we come up with sets of rules that allowed different services to coexist in the same band if we could keep one set of services indoors, another set of services outdoors? Coexisting with passive services, as Eric very nicely pointed out, molecules are not going to change their spectrum lines. They are where they are. And much as we all like broadband and want to remain connected, we also have to understand that as a society, we benefit from science users of spectrum. So how do we create spectrum rules that allow both of these conflicting demands to coexist and grow? Coexisting with unlicensed users of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz and maybe new bands that come up. I think 3GPP and 82.11 have made a lot of progress, learned from the lessons in 5 gigahertz, and we hope that that effort will continue. Again, this is my personal view, not speaking for FCC, but as a researcher, I truly believe that better coexistence between licensed and unlicensed is the way forward for improving access to spectrum. Machine learning was mentioned briefly by Prakash. And again, within the research community, we've seen how spectrum usage can be improved by the judicious use of AI and machine learning to manage use of spectrum. So if there are operators on the call, everybody knows that no operator today uses a single channel. Pretty much everywhere you go, you look at 4G, you look at 5G, channels are being aggregated, and that aggregation is changing on a minute by minute, maybe even on a second by second basis. How do we do this even more efficiently to make sure that we are making better use of the spectrum we already have today? And on that note, one of the engagements that the FCC has started is engaging more with the academic research community in the US. So earlier this year, we signed a memorandum of agreement with the National Science Foundation, which funds academic researchers to collaborate with NSF and the NTIA, the agency in the US which regulates federal spectrum, to work on setting up spectrum innovation institutes. We envisage these as being centers of excellence for spectrum research, because many of the topics we are grappling with today, especially to do with coexistence with passive users of spectrum, needs way more research, way more measurements, way more understanding of what the actual impact of these broadband services would be in those bands than we have today. And as a spectrum regulator in the US, and I'm sure it applies across the world as well, we can only make better regulations if we understand the state of play on the ground in terms of interference management. So in terms of where we want to go with 6G, we are going to continue all of the actions we have underway. Other actions that FCC is very positive about are not directly related to releasing spectrum, but again, addressing the more efficient use of spectrum, which is looking at things like open architectures and asking the question, if you had an open radio access network, would that enable operators to better manage the spectrum, get better utilization out of it, so we don't need to constantly allocate new spectrum as new Gs emerge? We really want to move to a state where we're not constantly looking at 6G followed by 7G followed by 8G and constantly looking for new spectrum for these services. Instead, I think the holy grail is to have a system of or methodology in place where systems can gradually evolve as new technologies mature, as new spectrum becomes available, as these networks become more controllable using AI and other methods, that we constantly make more efficient use of the spectrum that we already have. And that's all I had to say, and I look forward to the questions and discussions following the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monisha. And it's great to be sharing our initial thinking around 6G. It's necessarily at a very early stage, but the chance to have these international discussions really helps us to move forward. Now, I also wear a research hat at King's College London, but today I'm firmly wearing my hat looking after emerging and online technology at OFCOM, the UK's independent communications regulator. And I'm going to give some perspective on some of the needs for 6G and then hand over to my colleague, Cristina to actually link that to the spectrum implications that we've heard about mostly. Let's move on to the next slide. So we think it is important to consider what is expected of 6G from a vision perspective, to think about the services that might come from that, and to think about the technologies that 6G might end up consisting of in order that the spectrum requirements can be shaped to that. Now, it's a very early stage for this, but that we know there are a number of visions being shared. Hopefully those come together into a coherent vision. Whatever happens from that, we will regulate on behalf of the people and businesses of the UK to get the best from the technology and the spectrum involved. Some of the themes of those visions are very consistent with what we've seen from several previous generations. We'd expect, of course, stretching the use cases that can be provided, delivering good availability of the services from a coverage perspective, delivering energy efficiency and sustainability. We would observe that we've heard particularly about coverage and energy efficiency in at least the last 3 generations, and they've tended to fall by the wayside a little bit in pursuit of the new use cases. And perhaps 6G is an environment to really retain those important requirements. But additionally, we also see much more discussion about intelligent connectivity in the network and the devices, and doing that potentially more through fully embedded artificial intelligence into the network, but to do that in a way that's very secure and resilient in the process. And likewise, the relationship between humans and networks needs to be a relationship of trust for them to share the kind of data they do routinely in these environments. And again, we'd imagine that 6G will embed that more consistently into what it becomes. Next slide, please. Now, like Monisha said, we've also been engaging with the research community to understand more about the potential for 6G. And in January, we published the outcome of interactions with researchers all across the world, not only in the UK, on a number of the sectors we regulate. And probably most relevant to that is the area on mobile and wireless technologies that we picked out. And what I want to share with you is 3 key outcomes from that sort of aggregation of that research that I think feed into the 6G spectrum requirements. One on the services that 6G might support that exceed the capabilities of potentially even evolved 5G systems. Secondly, the trends that are sort of evolutionary and are setting the landscape for when 6G gets going. And thirdly, technologies that could be more disruptive and have a really significant difference in terms of the requirements for spectrum. So if we go on to the next slide to talk about services, what we certainly see is an expectation that a wider range of sensory communications will be one of the themes as we move into the 6G era. We're all very much occupying the audio and the visual domain. And the visual domain, incidentally, has a long way to go still in terms of requirements. We're not at the end of the resolution of the human visual system. And if you wanted to fool your eyes into seeing real reality, it would take 2.5 terabits per second. Now, not about to carry that over typical mobile connections, but just to illustrate there's a long way to go. Similarly, when we think about touch and feel and control, haptic communications, this drives not so much bit rates, but very high, very tight time synchronizations, even beyond the millisecond level that sort of evolved 5G should be capable of. And then there are other senses in terms of a wider range of tactile and even kind of the olfactory internet, but that's a subject for another day. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we've started to map out how those services may actually stretch the boundary beyond 5G capabilities. We also see great opportunities for services that are more inclusive, so that people that perhaps don't have full use of all the five senses can still participate very strongly in society. Next slide, please. So there are some evolutionary technologies, some of which Monisha already talked about, like the drive for open and diversified networks, the cloudification and softwareization of networks, and delivering evolved massive MIMO systems. These, I think, will really be table stakes for 6G and will be firmly embedded over the next 10 years as we come into the 6G era, and are really the subjects we hear about most from industry when we're talking about technology evolution today. But on the next slide, we go into some more long-term technologies that could really change the game. These include mobile not only being about terrestrial elements, but things in drones and in HAPS and in satellites coming together. Not only software technologies, but new materials and devices that can really shift what it's possible to process. The fully embedded distributed use of AI and new computing architectures, including neuromorphic computing. And likewise, the role of networks not only for communications, but also for sensing, which we've usually viewed as quite separate activities. If we go to the next slide, these technology trends queue up some implications to take into account for spectrum. The openness and the multiple technologies, so that as Monisha mentioned, we have the opportunity to not be revisiting this in every generation, making sure that networks are very tightly synchronized, making sure there's a mix of spectrum bands to cater for the wide range of use cases. And then lastly on the right, when I mentioned sensing, this actually creates a new requirement on spectrum in that, the physics tells us that if we want tight time synchronization, we need wide bandwidth, even independent of the usual capacity and bitrate requirements. And likewise, if we want tight positional sensing, then we need very small wavelengths, again, independent of the need for capacity. So there you go, Cristina, that's the challenge for spectrum. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And next slide, please. As you can see here, we've sort of, and as Simon has indicated, all of this new generation moving from 5G, 6G bring with them new technology challenges, but at the same time, and something that both Prakash, Rick, and Monisha have covered, the fact that the use of some existing bands or at least existing ranges, and here we're talking of all of the more common spectrum for mobile communication, but also looking at areas for innovation and growth, and in particular the type of growth that Simon was indicating when you are looking at precision that requires extremely high bandwidth. So it's not anymore only data rates, it's also this innovative application that require the sensing and the precision that will drive us in this world up toward terahertz. So as I was saying, every new generation look at new challenges, new frontiers. For 5G, as Eric and Prakash were saying before, it was millimeter wave spectrum, and it was a big challenge. Now the big challenge is terahertz spectrum. And I have to say, I'm sort of almost repeating, and this is the challenge of being the last, what my predecessor have said here in terms of what are the challenges in terahertz spectrum. Well, clearly we've got very, very high bandwidth, which is very positive, but at the same time, you need very high power to use use to stretch spectrum at terahertz level. And you also need to deal with a very, very new coexistence environment. So this is a spectrum that has never been used for terrestrial uses. And here I'm talking really the terahertz almost above 300 gigahertz, this sort of space above 300 gigahertz, not used for terrestrial use cases, mostly used for Earth observation. So different challenges from, as Eric was saying before, even only millimeter wave spectrum, where we were more used in the 26, 40, etc., to use this similar for fixed links. But in a way, OFCOM has dealt already with some of these challenges. If we can move to the next slide, because we've already made available spectrum above 100 gigahertz. So last year, at the end of 2020, we published our statement on making available spectrum for extremely high frequencies, and we have created a new license product for this. So we've made available in total 18 gigahertz of spectrum for innovative applications such as health screening, non-invasive quality assurance in manufacturing processes, and the high resolution positioning that Simon was talking before, as well as very, very high data rates link type of solution like that. So these bands, as I said before, not used for terrestrial, mainly used for Earth observation, which, as Monisha was saying, incredibly important use to collect weather and climate data. So space and science sector had to be considered and their requirement. The license, the approach that we've taken was first in the consultation one to go with a license exempt type of approach for this band, but engaging with the sector, and where we engage with the sector extensively, we realized that because of the very uncertain demand in this band, we wanted to make sure that we had some sort of understanding of where deployment were going to happen, and therefore in our statement we decided for a license approach in this band, but a very, very flexible license approach. So we wanted to go very early, enable innovation, but also retain flexibility. And in fact, these licenses, we've got a 1-year notice period to revoke the license. So the idea was to, as I said, enable innovation, but not prevent any future use. So flexibility was key for us, is in enabling this sub terahertz, so between 100 and 200 gigahertz spectrum. This is absolutely in line with our spectrum management strategy, which I'm going to talk to you in the next slide, please, where we've stated our strong desire, particularly to support wireless innovation, but also to release spectrum for local use and promoting spectrum sharing. So in a way, these 3 pillars are the 3 pillars for our spectrum management, and they will apply to whichever bands we're gonna look at for in the world of 6G. Bands being at lower frequency, bands being at mid frequency, bands being at high frequency. These 3 pillars set the how we will look at managing the spectrum. In particular, I want to draw your attention at the making spectrum available more quickly, and including when its eventual use is uncertain, which is what we've done in the 100 to 200. Releasing spectrum for the local use, particularly the vertical. This is something that we have enabled in the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band, plus some additional sharing band, including the lower part of the 26 gigahertz for indoor use. Again, and I know we may touch on this, to enable this digitalization of industry sector that do not require this wide area coverage, but may just require very localized shared access. And then I'll finish on one point that has been covered, I believe, by all, and it's clearly one of the key words in the context of 5G, which is promoting spectrum sharing. And for us, promoting spectrum sharing is both making sure that wireless system become more resilient to innovation, and we appreciate that this is a long program of work. We started actually trying to sort of embed this way of thinking from our previous management strategy in 2014, but it's also in a way allowing for more realistic analysis of the sharing between users. And I particularly appreciate what Monisha was saying on this last point. We really need to understand, we need to have more data to be better at managing coexistence between different users and being able to actually ensure that we are not catering for the worst case scenario situation, but actually be more realistic, more real world scenario in how we enable different users to coexist. And this will become particularly, this last point will become particularly important in the context of 6G, as I believe Monisha was also saying. We're not dealing with clean spectrum anywhere. We're dealing with spectrum that is being used by incumbent user across the board. Therefore, it's very important for us to really understand how we can optimize every single user, allow flexibility, and not prevent any new applications for the future. And with that, I'm going to hand over and pass to Sana. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all for your very interesting presentations. We have 3 questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to read these questions, and I guess the first one is probably Monisha might be the best person to answer, which is about the 12 gigahertz band in the US. And the question is, what about the 12 gigahertz, because you mentioned it, and how does the possible 500 megahertz change things, at least in the US? Over to you, Monisha.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, as I said, the 12 gigahertz proceeding is an ongoing proceeding. We are still, it will definitely add to the pot of spectrum that we have for 5G and future 6G. But as I said, there are incumbents there. It is going to be a band that will be shared in some way, form or the other. We are looking forward to receiving the comments from which are due in 2 days. And to see what folks think about what should the sharing regime be, how should that spectrum be made available for terrestrial services. So stay tuned. It will change. We hope to make actions. I cannot say anything as to where we will be, but this is an ongoing proceeding.
Okay, thank you. We've got 2 questions from the same person. The first one is, spectrum is a universal resource, so why can't it be managed centrally by the ITU, for example, which is a UN agency? Anybody would like to volunteer to answer?
I can start, and I'm sure, you know, OFCOM and others, the other regulatory agencies. I think it is just like saying that airspace is a universal resource, or roads and highways are universal resources, and why can't it be managed centrally? I think at the space where we are today, every country, every region has developed applications, different users of spectrum, federal users of spectrum. Every country has spectrum set aside for their national use, and that varies from country to country. So I think it is very, very difficult to have spectrum managed centrally for the entire world. I think what ITU and World Forums try to do is coordinate between, so that you have at least some ranges of spectrum that are available for similar services across the world. Wi-Fi is an example of that. And even then, we have differed, right? So for example, in the 6 gigahertz, the US and some other countries went to making the entire band unlicensed, and Europe decided to not do that, and that's because their conditions on the ground are different from elsewhere in the world. So we have to be cognizant of these differences in various countries.
Anybody else from the regulators? Yes.
Yeah, you can take also the example of Europe, where there was same debate, and you have some countries which are very close to each other, which have almost the same interests, but there was no real possibility to have some centralized European spectrum management. All spectrum management is still done at the national level because of the various usage, national usage of each country. And that's something which is really, I think, demonstrating the difficulty even more at the worldwide level to have something which would be a centralized spectrum management system.
If I may add, sorry, Sana, I would just sort of confirm everything that Monisha and Eric have said. So it's more of a role of coordination when we're talking about management at the ITU or at the European level, sort of setting ranges that could cut across services. But in reality, every different country may have a different sort of setup historical in the way in which the spectrum has been used by public sector or private users, commercial users, and therefore a sort of master organization and management would become extremely complex and potentially affect every single country.
I guess we have mentioned in the slides several times the role of the WRC, and as part of the ITU, for example, the ITU study group 3, which looks at propagation effects and asks the community, well, you know, countries and service providers and so on, to come up with propagation models for spectrum sharing. And then on the basis of that, we give that information to the next WRC. So that's our understanding. For example, in WRC 17, there were more frequencies that have been identified as potential frequency bands for 5G. But then in WRC 19, these were reduced a little bit, but they did encompass quite a few of those frequency bands where people went away and studied them. And we did have at least two of the speakers address the issues of the WRC, the coming WRC agenda, which is WRC 23 and 27. And so what is really the role of that? Because that's the idea, is that you identify some sections of the spectrum that might be of interest to across the whole world, and then people go away and give their own individual licenses in some parts of that spectrum, not necessarily the same. So for example, it could be 39 gigahertz in China and it is 26 gigahertz in the EU. It could be another frequency band in the US. But there was an agreement in WRC 19 as to these different frequency bands. So how do you see then the role of the next WRC conferences that are coming? And there was quite a bit of emphasis on them. And I think that was in the talk of Prakash and as well as Eric, if you would like to comment on those.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So let me go first from giving a vendor's perspective, maybe. I mean, WRCs have an important role in that it tries to harmonize spectrum as much as possible. Globally, if that's not possible, at least regionally. So, and that helps definitely from a cost point of view as we develop equipment, especially handsets. If we can achieve this global scale, then it definitely helps with, providing economies of scale. And you're right. I mean, we are not always able to harmonize perfectly across the world. I mean, if you take the 26 gigahertz band, for example, which is a pioneer band for 5G in Europe, in US, we auction the lower part of it. But we are still using the same HPP band and the same devices in US and in Europe. So even if you cannot, allocate the same spectrum chunks in different countries, if you can at least, harmonize the range, but then we can then use to build, equipment and handsets. I think that's already, positive for vendors like ourselves and also handset vendors, which need the economies of scale. So band 26, the 26 gigahertz band is a great example of a band that's available globally that we can use in US or Europe and other places. So as we move to WRC 23, there will be bands that we will start studying or candidates, and I think it's perfectly normal that as we start the actual study between the WRC cycles, that some of the bands get dropped. I mean, we'll have a list of candidates But then as we do more study, then some of these bands will get dropped. I mean, that's normal. I don't see any issue with that. That's why we need to make sure we get it right. We should not necessarily focus only on one part of the spectrum, like the terahertz. I think going into WRC 23, at least my view is, we should also have some candidates for the mid bands, maybe even low bands or the high bands, millimeter wave. Maybe there's other opportunities, not just focus on what. Otherwise, we're going to end up only with terahertz spectrum, and we're going to have another potential issue. So thank you.
Thank you. Eric, do you want to comment on the role of WRC? I mean, is it needed really? Do we need to wait for WRC 23 to study which frequencies might be needed modeling and from the propagation point of view?
Yeah, it may even start before WRC 23. Prakash said maybe WRC 23 will already list the bands to be studied. So maybe before WRC 23, we will already have something to prepared in terms of having a scope to the study to be done. And then, as you said, between 23 and 27, there will be a lot of work, including for the propagation model, for this new Eldorado of sub-terahertz spectrum. There will be certainly a need to agree on propagation model to be used in the studies. And certainly WRC 27 will not take all the frequency bands which will be studied. There will be a choice. That's normal because of the need to take into account passive services, the need to take into account other active services, and that will be accompanied with some technical conditions or regulatory conditions which will enable the protection of other services in the sub-terahertz spectrum. It was mentioned by Prakash that there will be also some mid-band to be studied. That's something which is yet unclear for me, and that's related to all this difficulty that we will have in mid-bands, which have been already studied many times, say, and where it's very difficult to find some Eldorado, say.
Yeah, just Sana, just to add to what Eric said. Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying we need to wait for 2023. I mean, as you heard from Monisha and also Cristina and Simon, for example, in the terahertz range, FCC and OFCOM have already released, like several chunks of unlicensed or lightly licensed spectrum, and then there's also experimental licensing available in US, for example. So all of these are already available at the national level. So I think you're going to see movements at the national level already. And then, studies will be done. And then as we get to WRC 23, there's probably going to be maybe a short list of bands. I don't think we need necessarily to wait for WRC 23. Thanks.
Okay, we have got another question. It's about the health issues. So the question is, what do you think is the bad health effects of high bands 6 to 92 gigahertz and beyond? I guess I'm not sure because this is 6 is not so high, but probably the higher frequency bands. I don't know if anybody would like
let me give a vendor response, and then I'll let the regulators answer. I mean, for us, it's very simple. There are standards created at an international level that we need to respect. So, I mean, there are people who do the research and then put out standards that we need to respect in order to protect people, from an RF safety point of view. So that's all we do. I mean, we just make sure we abide by those standards, and based on that, we trust the research community and the experts in that domain, and we just respect those limits that are put forward, and that should be it. And I think there's a lot of reference out there in terms of what are those limits, and I think at the regulatory level, national level, then the regulators, I think, they ask us to make sure we respect those limits, and that's what we do. But I'll let the others respond also.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here about the mid-band. So between the mid-band of 3.5, which is at 3.5 gigahertz, there's 6 gigahertz and sub-terahertz frequencies. Which band is most likely to be the one with most impact in 6G? And I think that question is also of importance to the research community if they want to start doing some research on the different frequency bands.
So
it's not.
I'll just say a few words
Monisha,
on
yes.
the, sorry, Eric, you want to go ahead?
Go ahead, Monisha, and then we go to...
Okay. So I think, as I mentioned, at the FCC, we're constantly looking at new bands. There are a number of bands already, the 24, 26, 37, 39. And these have already been made available. Now, which ones have the most impact? I think that is where the standards and the vendors come in terms of where are the devices and all of the other components necessary to make a network work efficiently, cheaper, more affordable, more available, more more reliable, all of those other things that are beyond just making spectrum available. Between the 7 gigahertz, at least in the US, between 7 and say 24, we are looking at 12. There are a few other bands that we are internally considering. But at least the way the FCC works is that we look for stakeholders to come in and propose that this is a band you probably should consider. These are the incumbents. This is how we could share it. These are the opportunities. So this is an ongoing process between what is going on internally at the FCC and what requests comes to us externally. So it's really hard to say which band will have the most impact. There are many, many factors that come into play.
Thank you. I wanted to add something on the. If you take the example of 5G before, if you take the economic value, the importance of the 3 gigahertz, it's much more important. The 80 billion of the US auction of the 3.7 to 4 gigahertz is just showing that. Now, in terms of what is disrupted, it's clear that for 5G, the use of millimeter wave is bringing something which is quite new in terms of technology, which may also enable to have some innovation in terms of applications, owing to the large bandwidth which is available. So maybe in terms of research and future applications, the millimeter wave is something which is more important, but that's what the future will learn. And I think you can apply the same for the 6G. Maybe sub-terahertz spectrum will be extremely important in terms of disruption, but it's clear that there will be a battle, an economic battle for the use of the mid-band, whatever it's 2.5 or 6 gigahertz for 6G too. Thank you.
We have another question here. It says, if identification of spectrum is so important for IMT, why has this not been widely followed for other wireless applications? Or is the value of IMT is diminishing with time? Anybody would like to?
Yeah, so let me try to take that one. Sure. Okay, so I think an IMT identification is important because it does provide the, at least in the mindset of regulators, around the world, which cannot really necessarily dictate, an ecosystem like, for example, US can, correct? Sometimes, as you see in US or other places, in some key countries or key markets, they can put out a ban on their own, and then, you'll have ecosystem that follows because that market can dictate an ecosystem. But I think for many countries out there, they do need to see that there's some sort of harmonization happening. And I think that's where IMT identification comes in. Having said that, I don't think we need to have an IMT identification necessarily for all bands. I mean, you can develop an ecosystem without an IMT identification, like we've seen, for example, with a 28 gigahertz band that FCC has opened in US and is being used elsewhere. So I think we'll need to, as we go forward, we should resist the temptation that we had in the past to go to ITU for every single band we want to open and ask for an IMT identification. And I would even be maybe put this on the table. Let's see if we need one, for example, for the sub-terahertz, spectrum. It's not clear to me right now if we need identification for that range. Is a mobile and fixed location enough? And if you have an ecosystem being developed, isn't that enough? So I would say it's still useful, but it depends on the ranges that we look after. We're looking at. I'm not sure we need to go for an identification for every single band that we want for 6G. So.
Question here on millimeter wave. You've mentioned millimeter waves. Of course, there's been quite a bit of research on millimeter wave already, and people have already got propagation models because it was like up to the 70 gigahertz band, and now moving to the W and D bands that have been already mentioned. So there is a question here which says millimeter wave already face many difficulties in terms of interference and high cost to deploy massive MIMO stations. Do you think it's realistic on the realization of high band and even ultra high band communication?
I can speak to that, Sana.
Okay,
so it's right that clearly multi-antenna systems, of which massive MIMO is one instance, are have become increasingly key in making good efficient use of spectrum, but does bring with it implementation challenges in terms of power, in terms of loading on the cell sites physically, and in terms of the high power devices that are necessary to make that work. But there are other ways of doing multi-antenna technology. It doesn't have to be ever bigger arrays on an individual site. So distributed arrays across sites can bring something to that. Coordination between sites, which is why we mentioned the importance of synchronization that allows each site to act as an element in a large-scale array, and actually leads to the concept of cell-free networks, which could really change the way that these systems are planned. Likewise, there are concepts where instead of putting the multiple antennas at the base station or the mobile, you actually distribute them somewhat passively around the environment, so-called intelligent reflective surfaces, where, as well as bringing benefits in the network, it actually delivers the user benefits in a more consistent experience, potentially. And then lastly, the physical challenges of the devices and so on. As I mentioned, there are real sort of new devices and materials like integrated structures based on graphene and metamaterials, which allow more efficient transceivers and antennas and mixers to be created. So I think there's lots of innovation scope in multi-antenna systems still to go.
If I may add to that a little bit. So I think there is massive MIMO and then there's millimeter wave, which are, I think, a little bit different. So massive MIMO I view as more in the mid bands, and millimeter wave is more beamforming, and then maybe you have multiple beams, but it's massive antenna elements, but it's not massive MIMO. And forgive me for being a little bit pedantic on that, because it does make a difference. And yes, I totally agree. And as part of the other hat that I wear, which is as a researcher, we have been doing a lot of studies on how resilient is outdoor millimeter wave. And truth be told, I think there is still a long way to go to make even millimeter wave work reliably as a standalone 5G technology. Today, what we see is that you get a great 2 gigabits per second connection when you're connected to the line of sight to the millimeter wave base station, and you turn your body or you move a few steps and you get handed off to 4G. So I think as we look to even higher frequencies, we have to rethink network architectures. We have to rethink where do we absolutely need this extremely high capacity? Do we need it outdoors? What is a person standing on the street going to be doing with 2 gigabits per second connectivity? Should that connectivity be better placed in places where people actually need it? I think, and again, this is my personal opinion, not speaking for FCC here. I think we, as a community, we may have rushed into millimeter wave as being the solution for outdoor mobile high-speed connectivity. And we're saying that maybe it does not fit that bill very well. And again, I know I've said it before, I really think that when we look at a next generation of wireless, we look at Wi-Fi or unlicensed and licensed in a more holistic manner. I'm 100% sure that most of us who are connected into the Zoom meeting are not doing it over a cellular network. When we are indoors and we're looking for high bandwidth, we don't do cellular, we go to Wi-Fi. When we are outdoors and we need constant connectivity, or we are mobile, we need cellular. And developing technologies and the network architecture to fit the way users use networks, I think, is something that 6G should really focus on more.
Yes, I mean, I agree that you have human blockage, and I see people looking at, there was one of the applications in the slides by Simon about vehicle to exit and vehicle to user, and the minute a vehicle passes by, you have 40 to 50 dB loss, and the signal is gone in millimeter waves. But is it more like really for fixed links, perhaps? Like point-to-point link, because that can give you building-to-building connectivity with high bandwidth without having to lay down cables. Because everybody talked about millimeter wave, but really now the 5G implementation has been in the 3.5 gigahertz band. So perhaps it was overrated, and maybe it is not so practical for mobile applications, but maybe for fixed links, it has lots of advantages. And that it gives you the bandwidth that is point to point, and you need to worry only about rain and snow in that case. So you do have some other issues, but over short ranges, it might not be so bad. You know, you might have a couple of dBs or 5 dBs losses, and it would work perhaps for fixed links more than mobile.
Yeah, and that's so yeah, Sana, I think, and but let me just go back to the previous question you had about which spectrum band would be is going to be more important, or I mean, it depends on the use case. I mean, I think you're going to have use cases in millimeter wave, in sectorized range, and then in mid bands, and then also in low bands. So that's why I keep saying we need to be very careful about creating a hype only on a particular band, because I think we're going to need all of them for different use cases. So this is going to be a mix, and we just need to make sure that we are going after all of these different ranges, and then make sure we have the spectrum available for the different use cases. So yeah.
I have another question, which is, what role do you see for AI in supporting better and more effective spectrum sharing and driving more value of the spectrum assets?
Yeah, I'd be pleased to say a word about this. So, I mean, I think we're already seeing machine learning and AI being applied to managing today's 4G and 5G systems, and already delivering significant value in optimizing those networks for user experience and capacity and so on. What we haven't seen is that tightly integrated into the very design of the networks, and there is an opportunity in evolved 5G and 6G to do that. My colleague Cristina mentioned that we're very keen to ensure that that sharing of spectrum is done in a more efficient way over time, and that we don't fall back on worst case propagation and usage scenarios for coordination. And AI and exchanging real-time data between systems, with the assurance of some control function that allows still some confidence that high quality of service is available. It's huge opportunity that machine learning can really help with the challenge of assimilating and responding to that data. It does mean that different systems need to be kind of standardized in terms of open interfaces in a way that isn't just within the normal standards environment, but actually between systems, potentially not just within mobile, but between mobile and license exempt and other systems, for that to actually work well. But it's clear that there's potential, but a coordination challenge to make that happen.
Yes, if I may add, I think we've just begun to scratch the surface of what AI and machine learning can do for better spectrum utilization, especially as I think everybody here agreed that as we're looking forward, spectrum sharing and coexistence is going to become a dominant modality that all networks, future networks, have to deploy. And one of the roles we at FCC are pursuing is trying to really understand. I mean, this is not something that the FCC would rule on, but we had a notice of inquiry out recently on open RANs, on open radio access network architectures. And one of the key impacts that an open architecture could have is on making the use of AI and machine learning a lot more efficient by, as Simon mentioned, by standardizing interfaces, not only at the ends, but also in the guts of the network. Because as I mentioned, and based on my research and based on what networks are doing, there is so much aggregation going on already, and this is only going to increase with more bands becoming available. Really understanding how to do that efficiently is a challenge, and that's a research challenge as well as a regulatory challenge, because now if you start thinking about how does a regulatory agency like FCC create rules, spectrum rules, around the assumption that somebody is going to have a more efficient way of managing access to spectrum rather than others. So there are a lot of, I think, challenges, but huge opportunities too in using these tools to manage spectrum.
Can I make one other point in follow-up to that? I mean, I think it's important that when we think about spectrum sharing, it's not only, you know, mobile sharing with other services, it's also in a sense mobile sharing with itself. So, you know, instead of us designating new bands, particularly for 6G, being able to use in a smooth evolution the bands that are already available for 5G and 4G and other legacy technologies, and finding ways that those existing bands can be made better use of by the community. We've seen techniques like dynamic spectrum sharing ease that process so that you no longer have to clear a portion of a band for a new technology to come in, and you can handle a mix of traffic. Going even further than that with more intelligent systems, I think will ease our job as spectrum regulators and bring the spectrum, you know, to the market more quickly as a result.
We have a question on millimeter wave, but probably we've already touched on it. It says, taking into account the entire frequencies are blocked increasingly by objects and obstacles, how do you foresee the use of millimeter wave and above for handheld devices? So I think we did already mention blockage.
We did. I mean, it's easy to just look at the high losses involved at these frequencies and say it's hopeless. And I wouldn't underestimate, you know, device manufacturers' ingenuity. We've already seen it in, you know, millimeter wave designs that you know, spread antenna elements around the device and make best use of what is available, because your hand is very rarely covering the entire device. No question that it's a challenge, and we may be talking particularly about form factors that are not a traditional handheld phone device, but a wider range of you know, larger form factor and, you know, non-human devices, as it were, for things, applications, and so on. So I'm sure there's a role, but it's, you know, as Eric ably pointed out, you can't change the laws of physics on these things.
No, I mean, I think it does work non-line of sight, so it does work by reflections, but I think you do get severe blockage from human and vehicles. So, but there are other applications. I think at some point people were considering get lamppost to user, so you are really standing next to the base station, more or less. So it's very short range, 50 meters or so. But it does propagate longer ranges if it is not blocked. And the issue is how to, I mean, you did mention reflective surfaces. If some human passes by and blocks your signal, you might get it via surface, but that reads investment in infrastructure, I guess, in cities, in dense urban environments, and so on.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what you just said, Sana, actually in Chicago, for example, there is an open park area called Grand Park, which is very heavily used in normal times for many events. And carriers, Verizon has deployed very, very dense millimeter wave on lampposts. So these are lampposts that are, you know, about 50 to 100 feet apart. And in that region, because there are no buildings, it's an open park, you get a good experience. But the flip side is, yes, there is infrastructure cost to doing that. And are you going to do that everywhere? Probably not. But there are, and this is, I think, reiterates what a lot of people have been saying, is that the higher frequencies are not a cure-all. They're not a panacea. They're not going to be the only modality that one uses in any future network. They will be an add-on for when you need this very, very high density, high capacity network, like stadiums and parks and other places where you think a lot of people are going to gather.
Yes, I think this point has already been raised by one of the questions, because it says, I imagine the cost of 6G spectrum and infrastructure would be quite high,
yeah,
and might make it difficult to actually utilize. So I guess we've already mentioned that issue. I've got another question here which says, Paradox 6G is trying to bring machines closer to humans and vice versa, but the more closer they come, the more stressful it will be for most stakeholders. Where are we heading for? Any guesses?
Yeah, I
Well,
think it's like anything else, correct? I mean, it's really on the user. I mean, we need to have some limits on how we use, devices, like anything else in life, I guess. So, yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure what else to say. And that's a real concern that some people have. I mean, it's really up to us to make the best use of the technology that we have around us. So.
In this respect, if you allow, the experience we have as regulator with this fear on exposures from EMF, is that a stations which is on the top of a building is something which is really felt as more threatening than something which is small, which is like a device and which is close to human being. We made some measurement once with some small cell installed on bus stop, and we measured that the exposure was more or less the same for those waiting for the bus compared to the exposure to some macro cell stations. So that was really the same level, same kind of level. And at the same time, of course, the exposure from terminals was much lower because the, say, base station, a small base station was more closer to the terminal. So there's really a possibility to explain to people that if you have something which is dense, which is close, you may not have more exposure. And people are hearing all arguments. I think the main difficulty that we have is that we are really wishing to have more data transmitted to people, and of course more data transmitted to people. All other things being equal, it means also more exposure and more frequency bands to be used. Just one point on the previous question. I think the cost of 6G spectrum is really to be looked at in all frequency band. It's not just sub-terahertz spectrum. So the cost is in a frequency band, and obviously 6G will be for certain usage, very hotspot and something in the sub-terahertz spectrum. And you will have also the use of mid bands, and Prakash also mentions the lower band. And that's the combination of all these frequency bands, which are really the cost of 6G spectrum, which at the end is not much different from what would be 5G, I'm sure.
I have two questions, but if we can answer them quickly. One, it says, do you foresee spectrum sharing strategies being a major component of standardization process such as 3GPP?
Yeah, I mean, as a vendor, for sure. I mean, this is definitely the main topic, I guess, going forward in terms of getting access to spectrum. And I do see 3GPP playing a key role in that. And actually, as a vendor, we've already started to look at that. And even in 3GPP, there's already some work, correct, beyond the current dynamic spectrum sharing technique that Simon was talking about. How can we expand that, not only to share between mobile operators, but also can that be expanded even to enable sharing with other types of incumbents? I mean, that's something that 3GPP should start looking into, and I think they will. So definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's, there clearly is standardization work to be done, and I'm sure 3GPP has a role. But it's for industry to decide. But it may be that 3GPP on its own is not enough, because there are very different communities of users with whom those 3GPP compliant systems will need to share. So there may be a role for a standards environment that credibly spans a much wider range of stakeholders there.
Absolutely. I think the sharing is between federal users, and depending on where in the world you are, is between federal and mobile, between mobile and unlicensed, between, there are all kinds of, and probably even newer regimes. And so this is an area for definitely standardization, but it is also a very, very promising area for research. That we hope that, if there are academic researchers listening in, will focus in more. We have done a lot as a community on cognitive radio, and I think the time has come now to take all of these research ideas and really put them into action.
Thank you. There's one last question. We have only 1 minute. It's about big data analytics, AI, machine learning, all work on prediction models, which are not always 100% correct. So in 6G, we're trying for very high speed data and less than 1 millisecond latency for autonomous vehicles and devices. Don't you think that we're limiting the 6G applications and accept that less than in future safe and sure ecosystem? So I think it's trying to say the challenge is quite big, because you want to have machine learning, which is working on predictions. Perhaps the models are not entirely accurate. And
that's why it's a research area. It
yes.
still is pretty much,
exactly.
Yes,
absolutely.
I guess the final take for me is, if we were to start research, and you did mention research more than once, is which frequency bands should we be looking at?
All of them.
All of them, yeah.
Yeah. But which ones, from where to where? Because the spectrum that was shown was going up to 450 gigahertz. So, but there was mention of D band, W band, between 6 to 7 gigahertz. 3.5 has already been studied quite enormously.
Yeah,
So
at least from a vendor point of view, we are looking at 410 megahertz up to 275 megahertz. I think that's quite quite large, obviously, but as I said, I mean, within that, you're going to have different segments, and we can pick some specific bands, correct, Van, to do the research and do further study, like DW bands, 3.1 gigahertz in US. There's 1.3 gigahertz in US also at FCC, I guess, may look into in the future. 6 gigahertz in Europe, like Eric Fournier was talking about. And then even the millimeter wave bands, there may be some opportunities there. And also 12 gigahertz. So I think the whole range, but then you probably will need to pick some specific bands where you have maybe a higher chance of succeeding, maybe in terms of, who you need to share with, etc. So. Okay, well, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And we've come to the end of the seminar, so our time. Thank you all very much. Thank you.